I've kind of already introduced Dr. Beeson, Gina, but if you guys would like to say anything to get us started.
Sure. So I'm going to jump in. So like Christian mentioned, my name's Gina, and I have known Dr. Eric Beeson for, I think, 5 years, I want to say. I started Northwestern's program back in 2015, where I had Eric as a professor for assessment course, I believe, was the first time that we met. And then after that, I applied to be a GA, a graduate assistant, and I was assigned to Eric in that time. And then we worked on several projects while I was his GA. And then beyond that, he helped mentor me into my current PhD program. I wasn't sure where or what direction I wanted to go in, and so we had a lot of different conversations around that during my time as a master's student. And then I finally ended up at Iowa, where I'm now entering into my 4th year, my final year. I just submitted my proposal, as we were just talking about a little bit earlier, and Eric's also on my committee. So that's a little bit about how we know each other in the context of our mentoring relationship. He's been a wonderful mentor throughout the years. He's really helped with getting me into the PhD program and figuring out my research trajectory and what I want that to look like, helping me articulate some of those research ideas, which I think is a critical component of a mentor. Yeah, so Eric, I'll turn it over to you if you want to give a little bit of context from your perspective. Uh-oh, Eric, I don't think we can hear you.
It's funny how I've lived in a virtual environment for 5 years and still show my mute face every now and again. So there you go. That's my mute face. I said, thanks, Gina, for the kind words, and I'll certainly reciprocate those. And I have to say, Gina let me mentor her rather than, me just kind of being in that place of, authoritarian mentorship, if you will. I think Gina was probably the second batch of graduate assistants ever in our master's program. And I know sometimes it's, master's programs are hit or miss whether they offer graduate assistantships or not. And we don't have a traditional one with stipends and things like that. So it really did take a lot of initiative for Gina to reach out and to be a part of that early cohort of what that would look like at Northwestern. And I think that's probably maybe one point just to maybe jump off of is just, I think one of the most important things, like coming at it from a mentee perspective, is just showing some initiative and being okay to ask the question and reach out and send a cold email. I think many times in my career, I probably talked myself out of some good mentorship relationships because I thought things like, oh no, they would never want to work with me, or, you have some of that, budding impostership syndrome, etc. So I would always say, give people the opportunity to tell you no rather than saying no for them. And, just see where it goes. You all probably know how to construct a wonderful email and have great communication skills and things like that. So I think that would probably be one of the first things I would say. And Gina, I think you probably embodied that to some degree because we were in class together, but then mentorship extends beyond the class and, kind of reaching out for those opportunities that were there. What would you say, Gina, about that initiative part?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the first step. Being in one of the initial cohorts at Northwestern in their online program, I think that we were indoctrinated with a lot of initiative. We knew that it was kind of up to us. If there was an opportunity that we wanted to have, we had to ask for it. So that was kind of a big component of my training, and I think something that has been really beneficial in the mentorship role. Because like Eric said, that's a big part of why, mentorship relationships happen is cold emails and calls and asking for things. So learning how to ask for what you want and what you need is important too from the mentee perspective. Additionally, I think also just forming relationships, having a network of individuals who have similar research interests is really important. That's another thing that when I first met Eric, he had some initial research interests that aligned with my own, and that has continued over the years with the neuroscience, and that's what my dissertation is on. So it made sense that, just kind of growing up alongside of, Eric in that moment kind of helped form some of that for me personally.
Yeah. Thanks for throwing that out, Gina. And just real quick, if you all want to jump in. Let's talk. Let's converse, etc. But I think that, and perhaps this is embodied in the values of this group that you all participate in, is this idea of collaborative mentorship, because sometimes there is an inherent power differential in mentor-mentee relationships, and I know that's there, just naturally because of the roles that you fulfill or the phases that you're at in your life or your career, etc. But I think there is, if you're looking at it from the mentor perspective and, you growing into your own mentorship identity, still approaching it from a collaborative lens, I think has been really useful for me, and I think one of the ways I embody that is like, I'm going to have projects that I'm like, I might be a little more directive in, and I might say, hey, Gina, I need you to do this. What do you think about that? But the other side of that is also, Gina, what are your passion projects, and how can you use this relationship as a way to nurture that along? And I think what Gina talks, in our situation, they aligned, but when Gina came on, we were focusing on a research project and sense of community and online education. So that was not related to neuroscience at all. And that was our primary focus. That was kind of like the, Gina, we got to get this thing done kind of thing. But then it's, Gina, what's your passion project? And that just happened to align. But even if it didn't, part of my role as a mentor, I believe, is still, helping Gina get to the next place that Gina wants to go, and using that sort of passion project to help facilitate that process. And as you talked about it, Gina, it was like, hey, it kind of worked that way. So, haphazardly or by intention, who knows? But it did work that way for Gina. So that's nice to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I just briefly want to mention, too, one other component. So you mentioned the sense of community project was one of the first things that we had initially worked on together. And that was also how Eric showed me my first professional conference. We went to ACES in Chicago that year, and I think that was a really wonderful experience just to have that exposure and to have that experience giving a presentation and jumping in on a project and kind of running with it. So that was another neat component of that time too. Yeah,
that's like I think one of the most, heartwarming things for me as a mentor is getting to introduce people to professional conferencing. Maybe that's just me, but it's just so fun to see people be embraced by a community. And you all were master's students at that time, which is, rare to some degree at an ACES conference, and to see everybody still interacting with you all as somewhat of colleagues in that environment, because they wouldn't have known that you were master's students unless they came to the presentation and you told them. But I think just to watch people kind of exist in that environment and hold your own, I think that's the heartwarming part of being a mentor, is seeing you all like be yourself and be awesome and do those great things. One other thing came to mind, I think, Gina, what you're talking about is one of my first mentors in my doc program. She would always say, get mileage out of your work, get mileage out of your work. You're going to be so busy. Make sure you get everything you can out of every project and squeeze it as hard as you can. And, for me, that starts in the classroom, which is kind of making sure, like, if I'm doing something for class, that I make sure it's meaningful outside of class. And then if it's meaningful outside of class, turning it into a research project. And if it is into a research project, turning it into a publication, turning it into a presentation, et cetera. So I think it's sometimes that happens maybe haphazardly, but I think if you think about it intentionally from the beginning, how can I nurture this idea, this little seed into all these different venues? Because you'll have to find ways to prioritize your time, especially those of you that are going to be in the professoriate one day, and how you're going to navigate your multiple roles. Like, you're going to have to research the things you do naturally in order to get the publications that you might need to get, etc. So I think that's one piece of encouragement I would throw out just as a kind of collective mentor right now, is just to think about, if you're doing something, how can you add a research component to it? Yeah, it takes a little more work, takes an IRB application, but again, if you're going to do it and you're going to do it well, you're going to put in the research on the front end anyway. So just go ahead and do it. Write up the IRB, collect some data, and I have a fly flying around in my office, so if you see me swatting at things, I promise it's really there. Yeah, that would just be one other thing I'd throw out. Get mileage out of your work, add a research component to it, if you can, because you're going to need that if you're in the professoriate.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you guys so far for your words of wisdom. I'm wondering what advice you might be able to give to our crew about maybe some advice for entering the mentorship relationship you guys mentioned, really knowing your needs and what you want out of the relationship. Wondering if you guys can speak a little more to that.
Yep. I think taking that initiative is the first thing, but I think before that too is really knowing what your goal is. I talk about this a lot with my master's students now, because they oftentimes approach me and say, hey, I think I want to get a PhD, and I know that you're doing this, how can you help me get there? And it's always about helping them know their goals. And I think that's something that Eric provided for me when I was in that stage too. So that's kind of how I formulate my goal planning with my master's students now is, what are you hoping to do at the end? And let's work backwards from there. Because I think that that's helpful, just knowing where they want to end up, what things stand out to them, what capacities they want to work in and stuff like that. So, and I don't know, Eric, if you want to weigh in on that a little bit.
No, I think that's great. I'm reflecting a little bit now, and I think our first conversation, Gina was going to be a future counseling psychology PhD student, and that was part of our discussion, just kind of exploring what your personal goals are and kind of what's the route that's going to help you get there. And even at the master's level, despite our KCREP standards that address counselor identity and stuff, I think master's students as a group still sometimes don't always know the difference sometimes of where they're going to go next. So I think that was a really fun conversation that illuminated that decision point along the way, Gina. And I think along those lines of like, how do I enter into the relationship? I think for me, it's helpful to know what folks need from me too. And, part of being a professional is identifying your boundaries and your limits. And, we don't want to commit to something that we can't fulfill and meet your expectations either. So I think part of that fit is just not only knowing your goal in like an outcome academically or in a project, but like knowing your needs about just time commitments and, here's what I specifically need from you or not. And I think, Gina, we embodied that in your dissertation team and your dissertation committee. And I think my first question was like, how do you see me fitting in? Like, it's kind of like, why do you even need me there? And I think just making sure that there's that fit and that I can fulfill that role, I think that's been really useful. So just having a little bit of that, mentorship planning in the very beginning can see that if it's a fit or not, and if it's not a fit, no hard feelings, or if people don't have the bandwidth, no hard feelings. Hopefully we can connect you with somebody else. So that kind of goes back to that idea of, don't say no for other people, give them the opportunity at least, because I'd hate to miss that opportunity as a mentor, and I think also as a mentee, I would hate to miss that opportunity too.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking back to that conversation too, it was incredible because Eric helped me identify in that moment. I was telling him what I wanted to do at the end of my career, and he was saying that it just doesn't align with being a counseling psychologist. So he helped provide that clarity in that moment, which I think is a really beautiful thing. And yeah, just a great opportunity.
It's funny. I was like, did I say that? I don't know if I said that, but maybe I did. And I think that's You know, I think sometimes even being in a mentorship role, like I'm pretty process oriented in just about every area of my life, but there are definitely times where a little bit more directiveness is called for. And, you know, especially, you know, I think you have to have some of those authentic boundaries set up early on about, you know, I might have to call you out on something, Gina, and I might have to, you know, give you a kick in the whatever if you need it, or give you a pat on the back if you need it. So I think, you know, much like I'm thinking of like informed consent in a counseling process, you know, setting expectations in the very beginning for how you're going to work together, I think is really useful. And, you know, giving each other the freedom to give feedback throughout the process too, because certainly if I'm not fulfilling my role as a mentor, I want Gina to tell me too. You know, and I think that's the other part that I maybe look back on myself as a mentee. And there were definitely times where mentors, and maybe I need to there might have been times that I thought someone was my mentor and maybe we never had that conversation that they were actually my mentor. And so that might have led to some unreasonable expectations on my part, you know, and I think that that's part of that really important conversation in the beginning is kind of, you know, call it informed consent, call it whatever you want to call it, but just, I think formalizing it to some degree has been helpful to me. And I think when I think back of some of the mentors that I've had, the better mentors that I've had, that has been something they've really advocated for is like, let's really formalize this to some degree. Like if you're going to call me your mentor, I want that to mean something, you know, not just, oh, I like them, or, oh, I read their research, or, oh, I had a class with them. That doesn't necessarily make them a mentor, you know? So I think there's some formality that's useful in those situations. I see head nods. I need to hear from folks.
I was just going to comment on a lot of what you're saying resonates with me. The hesitation, especially as a first-year PhD student, trying to figure out where my place is and how to ask for that mentorship and how to determine appropriate mentors and figuring that relationship out. So I'm finding this conversation to be very helpful. And I appreciate the encouragement to be very candid and explicit in as you're developing these relationships.
I was just going to say, I know part of what you all are doing is focusing like on writing too, and specifically, we're kind of talking about mentorship more broadly, and I know some of you all have the really specific focus right now on mentorship and writing and being productive in the writing space too. So, Gina, you were going to say something else, but I thought maybe we could just open it up to some maybe more focused dialogue about mentorship and writing too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna kind of respond to that first year doc student feeling real quick, and then I think definitely talking about the writing process would be helpful. A wise mentor of mine, maybe in the room, said at one point that a PhD is what you make it, and you know, it is like as much as you put in, you'll get out. So entering into those relationships and navigating that, even though it is challenging up front, I think can be so well worth it towards the end. And, you know I'm not done yet, but I'm getting closer, and just seeing how some of those, you know, mentoring roles within the PhD and even just collaborations between other faculty members and myself and even other students too has been so helpful. But being direct and putting yourself out there, even though it is uncomfortable, it is worth it. So
yeah. You know, now I'm putting myself in first year doc student mode, and I'm like, what was that like? What was helpful? What was not helpful? And I guess I want to share one side that I think was less helpful for me is also same thing from like a mentee asking for a mentor. I think it also works the other way too, where, you know, be careful not to limit like the options that mentees have. And I can remember people telling me, oh, just get through your stats classes. You know, I was like, just get through them? Okay, like where does that come from? They're like, oh, everybody struggles, just get through them. And I was like, I don't know, like that doesn't set right for me. And as I look back, like I wish I would have dove deeper into those opportunities that I had as a doc student. So it kind of reminds me, Gina, what you're saying about, you know, it is what you make it. And perhaps I learned that a little bit the hard way. So, you know, even though your mentor is a mentor, you know, also, you know, be a reflective practitioner yourself, and, you know, still pay attention to your wants and your desires. And maybe it wasn't a fit that time, you know, maybe they weren't as statistically inclined as I might have wanted them to be, but we didn't talk about that again. So I guess I'm sharing some pitfalls of my search for mentorship, and hopefully that'll be helpful to some people there. And I'll also say, you know, I took a couple classes with the second and third year doc students whenever I was a first year doc student. And that was really helpful too, to have the mentorship within the program as well. So I think sometimes we think of, or at least in my mind, sometimes I think of mentors as people that are a few levels ahead of me in that ladder. But much like Gina's talking about, as a doc student to a master's student, or a first year doc student to a second year doc student, you know, I think that you find a lot of valuable mentorship in all of those relationships, and probably even vice versa. You know, Allison, you mentioned you had how many years of experience in school counseling?
I'll be starting my 15th year.
Right. So if I was a faculty in your doc program, like, you're going to have so much more experience than me in school counseling, right? So in some ways, you could be my mentor if I was going into school counseling, but I could be your mentor if you were going in another direction. So I think those are the really reciprocal, collaborative things that make mentorship so fun. And I think sometimes that's important as you navigate the who am I as a first year doc student. Well, trust what you know, trust the experiences that you have, trust your personal expertise that you can bring to the relationship as well. Because much like you all learn to be educators, you're not an empty vessel, just like your students will not be empty vessels. So how do you nurture and cultivate your own strengths, your own capacities, your own experience, and then lean into that tension sometimes in the mentorship relationship when those roles and expertise might come together?
We have a question from Melissa in the chat. She is wondering if either of you could speak to the process of writing, publishing an article from your dissertation in terms of mentorship / co-authoring with your chair. Gina, I know this is something that you're working on. I'm wondering if you could start.
Sure. So I have yet to finish a dissertation. I'm just in the beginning stages of it with the proposal. And I think, you know, just from a writing perspective, I think being clear up front and, you know, entering into that conversation with the expectation of, hey, I want to invite you into this process of writing with me, and establishing those roles early on, I think is important. And additionally, just making sure that it's you know, a benefit to both individuals. I know early on too, and this kind of speaks to that first year doc student stuff too, is early on, I know I wanted to sign on to any and every research project I possibly could. And then by the end of my first year, I was involved in way too many things, and I didn't have a clear research trajectory, and I didn't have that clear, like, golden thread throughout all of my projects. And while that's not necessarily the most crucial thing in research, I think it definitely helps to build that expertise and to build on previous projects and stuff like that. So making sure that it's a mutually beneficial project for both individuals, and it's not something that's coming out of left field for someone that they can't quite piece together in that golden thread.
Yeah. And I'll say one thing my mentor told me that I wish I would have listened to more was, the longer it goes on, the less likely it is that you publish it. And I think every mentor I've ever had has told me that same thing. So I think starting early, be thinking about that publication process and just getting it done as soon as you can post defense is really a nice thing to consider. And I want to speak to that unfinished project thing in just a minute, because mine is still not published and may never be, but there's part two to that story. But I wanted to speak to the authorship component of that, because people also told me, talk about authorship early and often, and continue to talk about it, because it'll save awkward conversations later. It only took one awkward conversation for me to realize why that was so important. So I think this is a more broad conversation when you're entering into writing teams and writing collectives, is to establish authorship early on. Authorship determines workload a lot of times. It helps clarify roles. And it also can, if you're in a collaborative team that's kind of mentoring one another, for me, it's really helpful to share the workload too, because I might be first author on this project, you might be first author on this other project, and it's another way to get mileage out of your work again, and making sure you're working kind of efficiently and feeding off of each other's strengths. And I think that's why I want to speak to the collaborative mentoring piece again so much. Is I think that's been the number one benefit for me early in my career, is just having a collaborative team of people that are at the same phase of career, but different myriads of experience, so that we can learn from one another, mentor one another. So it might not be the traditional, like, oh, I need to look for that full professor mentor that's published 72 articles and written 3 books, but I need to work in a collaborative mentorship relationship with the people that are around me, even at that same phase, and challenge one another and learn from one another. And that's probably, I would say, the number one thing that's helped me early in my career. I would not be where I am today if it were not the team of people I had around me. So I think that's been really valuable. My chair was on me to publish my dissertation as much as she could be. I will say that. She was going up for full professorship, so it had value to her, obviously, to have more publications under her name, etc. But honestly, I started a full-time gig my 3rd year while I was finishing my dissertation. I moved after my 4th year to a new state. Like, it wasn't happening. There was just a lot of changes in life. And every now and again, I'll have a student that like reinvigorates my interest in my dissertation topic. And I'll be like, I got this half-finished article over here. I got this other thing over here. And I think sometimes that's fun. And that was my first publication ever, was my mentor saying, I got this article. It really stinks. I could use a fresh set of eyes on it and see what happens. And I was like, wow, they're going to give me the keys to this article. And like, that was so empowering for me to even be considered there. And we were able to continue it and evolve the manuscript. And that was my first publication. So I think that's been something I've tried to give back to, is, hey, you're interested in this, and I have kind of these other things too. What do you think about working on this project or seeing it through? So that's my unfinished dissertation that still remains unpublished, but it is what it is. It's not the end of the world if your dissertation doesn't get published, in my opinion. You've got other things to work on too.
If I may add something, my dissertation wasn't published too. So I did a pilot study, but I think as I reflected on it, I think when we were looking at dissertation, oftentimes you just want to get something done, and you might not, subsequently you will realize that what you have completed probably wasn't publishable material because of the methods or whatever. So we have to think about the costs and benefits. Sometimes when people say a done dissertation is the best dissertation, but it might mean that dissertation will never see daylight because it's not good enough. So there's always a cost and benefits to that. So yeah. The other thing I was also thinking about, because coming from somebody who get transplanted into this culture from a different culture, we always, like, for me, even though I'm extroverted, but asking for something that is outside of my realm of existence or experience is also something not easy. So we always wait to be given the opportunities. Maybe some of us, even though you might have come from that background, like if you are female, you don't, the guys get everything, right? But the female don't get, or something like that. So it's just not easy for us to posture ourselves, so to speak, to seek for a mentor. And from that perspective, I think it's so important for counselor educators, for those of us who are a little bit further down the road, to remember to be more proactive in extending the is it olive branch or extending that invitation? Because I remember I was invited by Jerry Trusty to be his research assistant. For those of you who know Jerry Trusty, who is in the, he's now retired. So if he had not asked me, invited me, I would not have the opportunity to learn so much from him. So and I'm also thinking about, for those there are quite a few of us who are from the minority backgrounds. Sometimes you will probably have to remember that you have to step outside of your own comfort zone in order, like code switch, in order for you to function in this culture, because not all people are ready to just come to you and give you opportunities or extend the invitation to you to invite you to collaborate with them, but we have to ask for it. If not, oftentimes people may not be aware that they have to be more mindful of the cultural differences.
I think that's important to, I think it's important to consider too, when you enter into some of those mentoring relationships, just what role culture plays in those too. My current cohort at Iowa, I have 3 peers from South Korea, and I have 1 peer from China, and they've talked a lot about how difficult that is to kind of cross that cultural boundary, and how sometimes even in like supervision and those types of roles, things have been uncomfortable for them because of that, misalignment between the cultures that they're experiencing. And I think it's a balance, like you said, to not only step up and enter out of your comfort zone and lean into that discomfort a little bit, but also, like Eric was talking about a little bit earlier, like remembering other students' interests and things like that, and inviting other people into things as a mentor when you have that opportunity as well. I think that balance really can help to, bridge that a little bit more.
Yeah. No, this is all reminding me of a couple different experiences throughout this process for me. And I think I've talked with different people about this, and I think there's different opinions, but I don't know that I'll ever publish a single author paper in my entire career. I don't know that there will ever be a reason to, and there will probably be people that disagree with that statement. So don't take this as like something you should do or aspire to. But I think it's that same thing that we're talking about now, is like, who can I invite into this project? Who will this be an opportunity for? And I think that, as a white cisgender male, part of it maybe is redistribution of power. Maybe part of it is just giving opportunities because other people have given me opportunities. However, for whatever reason, I think it's important to do that, as you all are mentioning, to open up that door for folks to walk through. And I need to work a little harder to do that sometimes, because regardless of how open you might feel, you still might not be perceived as open for whatever reason. And it may be no fault of your own. It may just be your status or your accomplishments or something like that might say, oh, I'm intimidated by this person because of their CV. And you might have to work harder to show that, hey, I'm more than what's on paper. I am a person still. I am connected to the development of the next generation. And I think you'll find that most people are really committed to that. And that's the thing that warms our heart as counselor educators. And I hope it'll be something that warms your heart too, as future counselor educators and mentors, just to be able to give those opportunities and to take people to conferences and to, do all those things that end up being fun out of the mentorship process. Now, Yoon Soo and Gideon are having wonderful conversations down here. Bring them into the room.
I can go off mute, but Yoon, by all means, jumping in.
Oh, I was on mute. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say I really appreciate the fact that Gina and Dr. Basin are talking about the importance of bringing culture and cultural dynamics, how they might play a role in mentor relationships. And I think, I don't know how to pronounce the Dr. Jay's name, but he was talking about especially mentees who are not originally from the United States. Me, just thinking of me in my first year of doc student, I'm originally from South Korea. I didn't even know it was okay for me to reach out to ask for mentoring relationship. So I really appreciate the fact that you are sharing that anecdotal experience and also like reaching out, like mentors, especially if you have a like international student in your counseling program, rather like waiting for them to reach out to you. We may need to, like, as counselor educator, may need to reach out to them so that they know that it's okay to ask for mentoring opportunity. So I just wanted to share that, and I really appreciate the fact that you're bringing the culture in mentoring relationship.
Yunsu, as you talk about that, like, and now I'm thinking as a mentor, like, how do I let folks know that it's okay, right, to reach out? And now I'm thinking about, how do you present yourself on the website? You know, what does your bio look like? What would it mean to start an informal research lab or a research team that just had a, you know, interested in this research, click here? And, you know, yeah, I think there are strategies that we could do as mentors to make that a little bit easier. You know, and I'm not saying it's all your responsibility as a mentor, because certainly I don't believe that, but I think there are those little things that don't take really any extra work. They just require a little extra thoughtfulness, you know, and thinking about how do you provide those opportunities. And I've been, one of my, I guess, new mentorship ventures is looking at formalizing. You know, I think sometimes we don't think about research labs, and I know in our field as counselor educators, and we're certainly not probably going to have a lot of microscopes and fMRI machines and that kind of lab, but kind of thinking about what does social science research, what does counselor education research look like from a lab setting, you know, and having those opportunities that are revolving, you know, so that, again, your mentorship also feeds into other people's mentorship, and it becomes sort of a mentorship family tree, if you will. That was something I learned about from some of my mentors, from some of my mentors' mentees across the years, is that there's a sense of community and connection to that mentorship lineage too, you know, and I think that's something to be nurtured as well. You know, and, you know, I think there's I don't know, Gina, I guess I'll put you on the spot. Is that something that you felt at all?
Yeah, I think, so we did our mentorship family tree at Iowa in our first year, and I remember emailing you and saying, hey, would you mind being part of this? And it was amazing to see how it did create that, like, sense of community, and how there was, you know, again, like I mentioned before, my colleagues at Iowa and we come from different areas, we come from different geographic regions, we come from even different, like, backgrounds. Some of them are school counseling, some of them are mental health counseling. Our program also has a lot of rehabilitation counseling, and it was amazing to see that there was even some crossover between our family trees, so to speak. So I think that's definitely an important aspect too. It helps give you a sense too of how small the field can feel at times. But yeah.
I'm loving this discussion about, as Bali mentioned, the bidirectional process. I'm wondering, either Gina or Eric, if you guys could talk about how to talk about that in a writing sense. So, you know, you're talking about authorship earlier, and how, you know, you want to make sure that maybe roles are defined with, you know, the writing contribution. How can you go about advocating for your needs in the writing process and that negotiation with the mentor?
Yeah, I think, so Gideon in the chat too, so power and influence within writing relationships, absolutely. I know, at least in the context of Iowa, we've been instructed from early on in the process that if you want to bring an idea to a faculty member, make sure that you've thought it out, make sure that you have something to present to them, not from the sense of, like, you know, you need to have your entire research study together and, you know, perfect, so to speak, before presenting it to them, but just so that, you know, like we've mentioned a few times, that they have that clear expectation of what you need. in that role. And I think that that's something within the writing that's so important, because if I were, you know, a beginning doc student and I went up to a faculty member and said, hey, I want to do research with you, they might not know exactly what I mean by that, right? They might have some difficulty materializing that. And unless they're actively working on another project that needs someone to come on just as a, you know, like Eric, you mentioned your first publication just needs a fresh pair of eyes, fine. But if they don't have that, then it's going to be really difficult for them to scramble and put something together for you as a mentee. So making sure that you have an idea of some of your research interests. You might not have all the ins and outs of how to do that, and that's fine. But just from a student perspective and from a mentee perspective, having that thought out a little bit is helpful. And like Eric, you mentioned too, just having that expectation of like what you want them to contribute. You know, like you mentioned with my committee for my dissertation, you know, how can I fit that need in this? So.
Yeah, and I think that translates over to writing needs too. Like, you know, if I need someone that's an expert in this methodology, so I'm going to seek out a mentor in that methodology to really just, and that's really all I need them for in a writing project. I need them to help me write out my methodology, make sure it's sound, and really be there on the research team for that. But maybe I can carry the rest of it. You know, so you kind of negotiate that on the front end. Well, okay, as a methodologist, I would expect myself to be here as author. What are your thoughts about that? And I still think it's just that bidirectional dialogue about where do I see myself. I'm probably not, I have a, wow, I don't even know how many people there are right now. There's probably about 8 people that are going to be on this massive systematic literature review that we're doing. And this was a conversation we had before we designed our methodology. And, you know, what came out of that conversation was where people's energy and time availability was. You know, so I think we kind of left it as like, here's going to be kind of tiers of authorship order, and then we'll see how things go throughout. But it helped them say, okay, I'm going to need to put in work on this one, or, oh, I can take a little bit of a back seat on this one. So I really just still think it's about that openness throughout. And I know that doesn't address some of the power influence that Gideon you're talking about too. And as a mentor, I need to be the one that's aware of that and navigates that too. You know, as a white cisgender male, I need to pay even more attention to it. But I think that as a mentor, you're in that power position anyway. So I think that you'll need to navigate that process too, because there's the risk of unintentional manipulation or unintentional, you know, use of someone else's work for my own gains. And I've heard too many horror stories about that. So maybe it's a cautionary tale of buyer beware when you're shopping for mentors too, you know, and perhaps you'll get a sense of that from your colleagues. You'll get a sense of that from their publication records, and kind of, have they been first author on everything? You know, I might look at that on their CV. You know, that might tell me something when I go into that. Not to say that that's necessarily a deal breaker, but that might be something that I keep in mind when I go into that relationship. Or are they always like third or fourth? You know, I think that tells you, or doesn't always tell you something, but it can give you a sense of like how people view themselves in relation to the teams that they've been on in the past. So I think that's one thing I might consider that I haven't quite considered before, actually. So I love that I'm learning more things now about how I might approach and encourage other people to approach this. Christian saying, wondering about disagreements. Oh, wow. Disagreements. Well, I hope we're good as counselors to be able to navigate that stuff, but experience would say that sometimes we're not the best practicers of what we preach, right? Sometimes we still get into some of that, you know, complex interpersonal dynamic stuff that plays out. And then we're like, how do we get stuck in this? You know, and I hope that you're able to have those open dialogues. And, you know, the more work I think you put in on the front end, the less likely some of those things will happen. So that, again, I guess brings us back to where we started, of just making sure you do a little semi-informed consent kind of process in the beginning. So you do kind of lay those things out. And then it also becomes something you hold each other accountable to as well. Of, you know, hey, Christian, you said you wanted to be first author on this, and it seems like I've been doing a lot of the work. Can we talk about that a little bit? You know, and I think we have to be able to and willing to have those conversations. And if the relationship ends, so be it. You know, it's okay. That won't be the death of your career, probably, even though Gina says it's a small profession, and it is. Be mindful of what you do at conferences. I'll just say that. Be mindful of what you do at conferences. Yes. So that'll be my mentorship lesson too. Be mindful. Because I would be worried if my mentee was acting a fool at a conference too. And I've seen that happen sometimes. And it is a small profession. So that'll be one other little piece of information I'll throw out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just entering into those disagreements or conflicts with that respect and authenticity and transparency. And I know I've had several of those uncomfortable conversations regarding authorship, regarding, you know, not continuing to move forward with particular authors and stuff like that. And I think the most important thing is just approaching it like you would in a counseling session from that lens of a confrontation, right? Here's the evidence, here's the confrontation, you know, and putting that out there that you still respect them as a person and stuff like that. And you hope that the relationship can continue, but reminding them of that informed consent process that you went through at the beginning, hopefully.
Yeah. And maybe it's just a matter of, you know, not now rather than never, right? I think that's something that's important too, to just, sometimes people just need to be let off the hook too, frankly. They have some shame, they have some guilt if they're not meeting their expectations. So I think sometimes just acknowledging that and seeing people as people too is really important. Gideon's sharing a resource down here.
Offer this up because I only recently came across this, and I think it's such a potentially interesting way to have the conversation about authorship, that it's really about contributorship, and that there's different roles that contributors could you know, contribute to a piece moving forward. But by way of thinking about how do we liberate the conversation so it's more accessible for folks, there's this interesting credit model that I haven't seen used a whole lot in counseling, but more so in other the hard sciences. So I just wanted to pop those in there.
Yeah, I think the good news is depending on the university that you're at, I mean, authorship is going to be more or less important. You know, and if you're at maybe an old school ivory tower-ish place, first authorship matters. If you're not, first authorship really doesn't matter all that much. And even if it does, second and third authorship are treated the same. Third and fourth authorship are treated the same. Normally, it's only a distinction between first authorship or not. Some universities will differ, obviously, so don't get me, that's not going to be true at every place. But I think that's another thing to consider too, just to what degree does this even matter at the end of the day? And I have this existential debate with myself just about every publication when I think about how many hours I put into a publication versus how many hours I could spend doing something else in the world. And I have to kind of just be humble and be like, is it really that important at the end of the day? You know, and I think that's just something you'll have to answer for yourself and your own values and kind of where you see yourself there. I've got off track, but I'm going to stop for a second.
I think with regards to that, I think ACA Code of Ethics, one of the sections talks about research and authorship. And APA has the same guideline too. I think it will be important for doc students and master students to also be aware of that. And I personally have decided to stop working with some people for sure. And after a while, you know, I don't want to be taken for granted, for no, if first time, second time, the third time is on me if I don't decide for myself.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes it's not easy for those of us who don't find our own voice or who have yet to find our own voice. Very vulnerable doc students, you don't know, you go into the program, there might be nationally known ranked programs and you go right into it, but you know, sometimes it can be a pool of alligators. who because they are so pushed to do publication, oftentimes they will use a lot of students as part of the the resources, so to speak, and we do need to be careful about that, and I think it's good to have conversations like this to yeah, it's not easy, and usually you'll probably have to decide, I don't think I will ever do anything with this person anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really big, important component of this too. I know in my time at Iowa, I found that I work better with some colleagues than I do with others, and establishing those boundaries and maintaining, you know, the relationships around that too is important. Because, you know, like I said before, it is a small field, but finding the people that you work really well with and that you're able to publish things with, you know, whether that be your research interests align and you work really well as a team, that can really help too in navigating some of that.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to Gideon's idea of contributorship, and, you know, when you're thinking about collaborative mentorship too, as like more of a team-based model, you know, I think you are kind of thinking about, like, who do I need on the team? Like, do I need a vision guy or a vision person, or do I need a methodology person? Do I need a get it done person, or do I need someone that can, you know, think big picture as well? And I think that's another thing that I think you just kind of naturally gravitate to, but to also, I think it aligns, Gina, with what you're saying too about who do I work well with, you know, and sometimes you need people that are different than you, not just diversity and demographic variables, but diversity in thought and diversity in strengths, and kind of keeping those things together. And also not making that exclusionary either. Like, because now I'm thinking, like, I've been working with the same team of, like, it started as 3, then it went to 4, then it went to 5. And I'm like, can it continue to do that? And I think, yes, it can. It's just a matter of being okay with not being on everything, and being okay with taking the lead on some things and taking a back seat on the other. And if you're in the role of, like, I didn't carry my weight this time, then say, hey, I got the next one. Or if you're, you know, and I think that sort of just shared accountability in a collaborative mentorship team, I think is really useful. And it's efficient. I mean, let's be honest, like, time's going to be limited. And as we were talking about, you're going to be having some expectations on you. So, you know, building that team around you can be super helpful.
Yes, exactly. Go ahead,
sorry.
Melissa. No, I was just about to remind everyone to feel free to unmute yourselves, etc. So, Melissa, go ahead.
Okay, I saw your little thing in the chat box. So, can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what you think the ideal team would be behind an article in the different roles?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's knowing what I do well and then seeing what other people can contribute as well. And sometimes it takes doing an article together to figure that out, which is I think the kind of hard part, right? If you're just beginning to forge some of these relationships, not knowing right up front might be difficult. And especially if, you know, you have that informed consent conversation up front and other people don't necessarily know what they do well, that can be challenging too. And I know, just speaking from a, you know, doc student to other doc students type of writing, we're all just experimenting with it. So figuring out, okay, that works really well, or maybe that person knows methodology better than maybe I do, or maybe that person knows the literature on this particular concept a little bit more than I would. So structuring your ideal team around what you need in particular roles and getting to know other people and how they work, I think, are two of the most important things for me, at least in my writing.
Yeah, I think a couple of things come up for me. I'm putting myself back in doc student land for a moment too, and I'm thinking about how did that happen, you know? And this is kind of coming full circle for me now, because it also speaks to the value of conferences, you know. And I always dig through the conferences and I look at what the titles are, and I'm like, ooh, I want to meet that person. I want to go to that presentation. I want to talk to that person for various reasons. And I was building my comps at my first ACES conference, and I was writing about problem-based learning and counselor ed. And I looked on the program, and there was somebody doing a roundtable on problem-based learning and counselor ed, and it just happened to be Dr. Susanna Wood, who is now on Gina's dissertation team. So I was like, how did this come about full circle? You know, and I was a lowly doc student, you know, and I went to that roundtable and just, again, listened, learned, and said, hey, I am interested in this. Can we talk more about it? You know, and I think that turned into a couple unfinished projects that eventually will get done, but it still became a good mentorship relationship, even if it wasn't from a research and writing standpoint. So I think that was really useful, the power of conferencing. I think maybe that's why I go to conferences more, and that maybe why I'm sad that we haven't had in-person conferences, not because I don't believe in the value of virtual education and things like that, but because I love the conversations that happen in the hallway. I love the conversations that happen when I'm not in a presentation. And a lot of the things that I've done in my career have happened at conferences that were just one-off conversations. Starting the Journal of Mental Health Neurocounseling section was a one-off conversation in the hallway at a conference, you know? So I think that's part of building a team too, is still like just searching out people who are doing things that you're interested in, reaching out, building those relationships. And then, you know, I know this comes back to this idea of like trusting what you know and trusting that you are enough, you do have some assets. And I know that comes with all the cultural variables we were talking about, but I would consider that reaching out and doing it that way. I also would say that, you know, the first step of testing your ideas is sharing it with your peers and seeing if they hold water, and then kind of taking it to the next level. I'm a vision person. I draw things and then I text them to my friends and I say, does this seem like something that we could do? And then they'll say, no, Eric, go back to sleep. You're on an airplane. Or they'll say things like, yeah, let's do that. Let's turn that into a presentation. And then let's turn that into an article. And then let's turn that into a research project. And I think that's the last thing I'll say here. From an editorship standpoint at a journal, when I was associate editor, like I was mentored in a way that says, I want to nurture your idea. Then you need to turn that into a research project. And after you turn that into a research project, I also want to look at what that would mean to publish that too. So that's been one thing that as I look back at my role as a mentor too, it's about opening the door, providing opportunities as you were saying earlier, so that, you know, I can nurture a conceptual article. We can turn that conceptual article into a research study. We can turn that research study into a future publication too. So I think it also speaks to what we were saying earlier about getting mileage out of your work too. And sometimes we shut the door on conceptual publications or ideas or systematic literature reviews or something like that. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that even before you get to the research stage that can help you feel some of those things out. Because it's easier to kind of learn those things in a conceptual piece than it is maybe a larger scale experiment or a larger scale study. So maybe you do test the waters with a presentation, or you test the waters with a conceptual piece, and then see if that relationship morphs after that. Or if they drop the ball in the presentation, you know that you might have to part ways after that. I'm rambling again. Gideon, stop me.
I was going to comment, and this is going to highlight how green I am in the field of research and creating these collaborations. But it sounds like there are many different venues in which you can form these relationships. So it's not just through the university that you attend, but it's also in these conferences. Can you speak a little bit more about other venues to connect with people who have similar research interests?
Yes, I think that this is actually something that I've learned more recently as I've been approaching my dissertation. And I know, I think Eric mentioned a little bit earlier that it's been a challenge because it's during this time of COVID and everything else, trying to find people who are willing to support research that's not just survey-based. In this day and age where everything has moved online, I have found that I reached out to a bunch of different people in different schools, in different professions, in different fields who have similar research interests to what I have. And I was overwhelmed with the amount of responses that I got back and like the offers to provide mentorship if I needed that or provide more conversations. And some of these people were other doctoral students. Some of these people were also like department chairs of psychiatry and neuroscience. So I was really overwhelmed with the willingness to engage in some of those relationships just by taking that first initiation step of sending the email and asking for help, and saying, hey, I don't understand this concept. Can you please, give me your 2 cents about it, or give me your opinion, or, help me and all that stuff. So that's my experience with it.
Yeah, professional Gideon, I'm laughing at your comment down there. Gideon just set himself up for a writing project down the road one of these days. But I can't speak enough for professional associations and professional conferencing. I mean, there's interest networks, there's divisions, there's separate professional associations. Like, I think one of the best pieces of advice I got was just volunteer. Like, just volunteer for something, and just start like connecting in some way, shape, or form, and those sidebar conversations happen as a result of that. I think one of my bigger criticisms of our field right now is we've been so insulated and focused so strongly on counselor identity that some of our relationships with other professions have sometimes struggled. So I think that's where you look at maybe more topical conferences rather than profession-specific conferences, and that's where you'll build some interdisciplinary collaborations in that way too, which I've not been the best at, frankly. And I think that's something I could learn a lot from someone to help bridge those more interdisciplinary bridges in research and writing. So look at topical groups that exist, look at interest networks, look at divisions, and then perhaps professional associations. I run a mentoring group focused on one specific domain, but it's really turned into a little bit more of a continuing education group than a mentoring group as I had wanted it to be. So I think each group will morph into kind of what it needs to be at that moment. But I think the theme that I keep hearing throughout today is putting yourself out there as a mentee and as a mentor, making sure the door's open enough and the opportunities are there enough so that people can walk through it. And my experience is much like Gina. People like to know that folks read their stuff unless they charge you $10,000 for a half-hour email. Most people are going to be happy that you read something that they wrote and are going to be happy to see what happens next. And it's a professional courtesy, I would say, just to let them know ahead of time, like, hey, I'm taking some of your ideas and I'm doing this, or hey, I'm using the instrument that you created and I'd like to do this. Because you might even find out that they've already started doing that. It just hasn't been published yet. So, I think that there's a lot of unpublished stuff out there that would be useful to make those connections with. And this will speak to something I wanted to say earlier about we got to remember the justice orientation to scholarship too. And like, there are gatekeepers to scholarship and there are gatekeepers to what gets out and what doesn't get out. So I also want to broaden scholarship to also think it's not just journal publications, right? There are other ways of sharing thought leadership and developing ideas that may not be rewarded in a tenure or rank application, but have a lot of impact in the world. So I think that's the other thing I would throw out there. We talk about, I know you all are focused on writing, so I know that's why we've been talking about it so much today, but just also remember that there's mentorship in leadership, there's mentorship in program development, there's mentorship in just how to be active in your community. Like, I think there's all those other little elements that you'll have to find, where do I want to spend my time and invest my time? And I remind you of my existential debate about, is the world going to change because I spent 50 hours on this publication? Probably not. So where do I want to spend those 50 hours really? And I think at the end of the day, just staying true to your values and what's meaningful to you.
I would say for those of us who are in the cohort model, like your doc student, your own people, get to know your people, start presentations from there on. Yeah. The other thing that I've encouraged students to also like write small pieces like do counseling today, right? And psychology today, or just small pieces like the regional newsletter, just 500 words, 1,000 words, just give yourself that confidence building to just get yourself out there. Yeah.
I suppose I'll offer a question of my own that I am sitting with. I feel very like grateful and lucky to like have experienced really solid mentoring relationships, but I also know there's a dark side to mentoring relationships, which is like mentoring relationships that don't work out, or like that are just particularly fraught with interpersonal conflict. And I feel at this point in my career that I really haven't experienced a whole lot of those. But I guess I'm wondering if, you know, either for anyone in this space, really, like how would you recommend either being particularly aware of, or like have a good radar for maybe like signs of a telltale challenging mentor relationship, or even when you are in the midst of it, how to how to fight, freeze, or flee, or any mixture of all of it. I just want to lay that out there.
I'm just trying to read the room a little bit and see like who's thinking about that one time that they already have experienced and who's going to share it or not. Because I see the facial reactions.
I suppose for me, I look at it like any relationship should contribute to our wellness rather than not. Even though you might have a product, for me, like what Eric talked about, process oriented, so should not be product driven at the end of the day. Because if we can always find somebody who can actually give us that process and product, rather than get stuck with a relationship that can become toxic. And so, because a choice of a mentor, at a certain level, you have a choice, right? So, and at a certain part, you don't have a choice, and then finish that and just walk away, because life is too short to just spend on toxic mentorship. And sometimes, like I thought about, I was not able to walk away quickly from a certain thing. Then I realized it's because of my own personal things get dragged into it. Like I didn't feel good to leave that person, or that is a peer situation, right? That it wasn't like a mentor situation. Then I have to own that, because I allow myself to stay there for too long. So I think now that I'm much older, like, I didn't have to do that for myself. Yeah. I don't know if it makes sense to think of it from the mental health perspective.
Yeah, I think that is some good. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Melissa.
I was just saying that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it is helpful to see that perspective, and just, and Melissa, and what you were talking about with that trade-off of, this is productive, but it makes me uncomfortable. Like, how do you navigate those kinds of trade-offs, especially when there is that power differential? And I guess I think I'm very lucky to never have had that experience, but just seeing other people navigate those experiences, it's so hard to make those decisions and those judgment calls in that moment because of that power differential that you're talking about. And I think just having that that ability to see clearly and to know, I'm, like Dr. Ung said, I'm going to get out when I can, and I'm going to let this be in the past, is the best way to navigate those types of situations. Because I know sometimes it's not a choice of, can I get out of this relationship right now and find someone else who will be productive as well? It's more of, I don't know, biding your time.
Yeah. I'm reflecting on this illusion of choice, Melissa, sometimes too, of technically you have a choice. It's just the consequences of making some of those choices are so severe or so grave, depending upon where you're at. So I hear that. And I think that's, and when you were talking, I was thinking is this because it's one thing to just have an uncomfortable kind of relationship where we just don't maybe personally click, like we just have very different interests and things like that, but we still get products done, versus like this is an abusive relationship that I'm being taken fully advantage of, or there's some, explicit sexism or racism or something going on. So I think that like that would be my first question I would have to ask myself is, where does this exist on the continuum? And if it's over here, then, I need to use the accountability mechanisms that are in place. There was definitely a faculty removed from my doctoral program for saying things off the cuff that had been appropriate for a long time that were no longer appropriate anymore. And I think those are the mechanisms of accountability that exist, and they're there for a reason. When that illusion of choice kind of fades away. But then there's the other side, and I can think of this too, like I'm not going to go out and hang out with this mentor, but we're going to get work done. And then there's other people who are like, I'm going to hang out and we're going to do work while we're hanging out because we just like being around each other. And I think they both have a time and a place, just depending upon your outcome. People are interesting people, and they can still be really smart and productive in certain ways. And, I think the mantra I will is, what can I take away from this relationship? And I think, Wei, and you were saying kind of the cost benefit, is there enough I can take away from this relationship to justify me staying in it or not? And I think that's probably that internal self-reflection that you have to keep making with yourself, as long as, your life isn't in danger or there's not some significant trauma being caused. And then, hopefully we can all use the mechanisms of accountability that exist. But even there, right, it's a small profession. And, I think that's always a risk that's going to be there. It's less risky for me as a person with too much privilege than I deserve. But I understand that in other places and with other cultural identities and intersections of those identities, that it becomes very, very hard. And I think that comes back to maybe what I'm taking away most from our conversation today is I need to be more intentional about creating the openness and doing the reaching out. So I want to express appreciation for everyone of helping remind me of that today and how I can, enhance my own mentorship activities as a result.
I think we've been having a really great discussion, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. We have about 7 minutes. So wanted to thank you guys for a wonderful discussion, and just open it up. If anyone wants to share any comments, insights, or how you want to share how you want to integrate what you've learned here today with Gina and Dr. Beeson.
I appreciate, the feedback that y'all have given us and kind of that insight. I wish that I had this 2 years ago in my process. That would have been handy. But it gives me a lot of ideas about how to kind of proceed forward and clearly, what decisions I need to make. So thank you.
Yeah, I've taken a lot of notes, and I thank you for just all the different perspectives. As a student at Oregon State, we are a hybrid program. So my cohort, we all work full-time and do the doc program. So I think what was really encouraging to hear is when I think about seeking mentorship, I feel a little like paralyzed about how to go about it, because my to-do list every day is so substantial between work and being a student. So what I really loved was this idea of when I read research and I really align with what the person's, their research is about and what they're working on, and that it's perfectly okay to write to them and say, hey, I really love evidence-based school counseling. That's something I'm really interested in, and to just build some connection and start to establish some partnerships, and maybe further on in my journey when I'm not in coursework and have the ability maybe to help on projects and things like that. That's really helped me shift my thinking a little bit about what do I have the potential to do right now with all the other things going on. So thank you for almost giving me permission to reach out to people.
Can I add one thing on that real quick? Like, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say this too. Like, because you are affiliated with the university, it's just another nice practice to loop your advisor in too. Because you are an agent of the university to some degree, you represent the university. So I'm not saying that they have to be like your gatekeeper, but I think it just as a good faith effort, it's helpful to inform your advisor what you're doing and loop them into some of those projects too. Just for the sake of, it's a small profession and you don't want to burn some of those bridges by I've seen that happen to people before, so I feel the need to throw that out there.
Okay. Anyone else like to share, something that they've learned or want to integrate into their life, I guess?
Hi, my name is Carlos. I joined a little bit late. I really like the piece about getting explicit informed consent. So just really, as you mentioned, our time is limited. So as a mentee and as a potential mentor to those in the future, those around me, just getting, the clear idea of what I need from others. And I like what you were saying, as a professional, know your limits and your needs and what you could offer others. So you, right off the bat, you get to set, what this relationship is going to look like, and the parameters are set earlier on. Because I've been one of those that, in both ends, that I have had mentors, but we never talked or we never really got anything done. But in our minds, we have a relationship, but it wasn't, conducive to anything. So I like that. Like, hey, how often are we going to meet? What is their purpose? How often, what are we going to be working on? So I found that really useful.
I also appreciated, Gina, how you said to kind of like expand the reach of, thinking about mentorship out of the box, outside of just, in the profession itself. Because my areas of research interests, I will have to do that, expand the reach. And it was nice to hear that you got so much positive feedback and so much, so many offerings to help assist you in that research. I think that's really cool. And Dr. Beeson, what you had said about, I can't call you Eric still, but about again, expanding out into, different professions and collaborating. I think that there's so much opportunity for collaboration in that respect. So I really like that too.
I think one thing I want to remind ourselves to also that don't look at your doctoral dissertation as the in-all and at-all that you always have to start. If for certain reasons your settings restrict you because there's not a lot of options, you don't. The mentoring, what I'm trying to say is, there's always down the road that you can always, we all would need to grow. Like I finished my dissertation, I started working, but I still needed a lot of mentoring. So that's where I grew so much more as a result of my, when I was the first few years of my assistant professorship. So I think some of us, what I'm trying to say is encourage us not to just just focus on the dissertation in and of itself, that this has to be the best step forward. It doesn't have to be that way. So you don't find yourself that if you don't get that experience, you feel so devastated.
All right, so we are just about time. So I'll go ahead and close our webinar for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Beeson and Gina for their time and effort in putting together this great discussion, and thank you to all of the participants as well. Just a reminder, we will be sending out a survey so we can capture your experience, plan for future webinars. Your feedback is really important to us, and your responses will give us vital information for planning future events. Another plug is that this webinar will be posted on the CRLL YouTube channel within the next week or so. If you have any questions or feedback, we can all be reached via email. And thanks again to Dr. Beeson and Gina, and we hope to see everyone else at the future webinars.